Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Overseas Leafs Report. So the Maple Leafs had their first game back after the bye week in Detroit at Little Caesars Arena versus the Red Wings. And I think the best way to describe this first game was that it was pretty sloppy for both teams, actually. Leafs fell behind midway through the game, only to have Matthews snap a wrister to equalize. Power plays for both teams looked terrible. So it's only fitting that Dylan Larkin for the Red Wings got the go-ahead goal on the power play. Leafs tied it up with 2:19 to go and the goalie pulled. There was some review as to whether Marleau kicked the goal in, but it counted. Freddie Anderson came up big late to push the game into OT, which seems to be the theme for these two teams. Every time they've played this season, I think it's gone to overtime. Leafs had their chances, but it was the Red Wings who pulled it off on a Danny DeKeyser goal. Toronto had to console itself with just 1 point in this first game back. It was a back-to-back situation with a game versus Pittsburgh at home on the following night, which gave us our first look at Bukestad and McCann in Penguins jerseys. Beautiful pregame moment as they honored the Canadian troops serving abroad, and they surprised the family of one of the soldiers stationed in Iraq. No shame in admitting that everyone on our couch was feeling a little emotional. Garrett sparks in net, and also worth noting is that the Matthews-Marner experiment didn't last. Tavares, Marner, and Hyman were back together. This is the game that we saw Muzzin get his first big hit in a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey. Hit on Jake Gensel, which got people excited and talking. But then it was Sidney Crosby who got the first goal of the game on the power play. Pittsburgh got another goal, and it could have gotten much worse in a hurry, but Matthews got one back right before the end of the period off a Dermott flutter puck from the blue line. Dermott got his own goal midway through the second to equalize the score, and later in the period, Hyman battled well in front of the net to give the Leafs their first lead in 2 games. And that was it for goals. The goalies were pretty busy in the third, and the Leafs had a couple empty net chances, but nothing went in. That was a good home win for the Leafs. Next up were the Anaheim Ducks, who had just gotten smashed by the Winnipeg Jets beforehand, while the Leafs were looking to ride the momentum from the victory over Pittsburgh. And for a reason I can't explain, Anaheim wore the throwback jerseys. Leafs never stopped pushing right from the get-go, but had to wait until the second period for Tavares to register their first goal. Later in the second, Janssen added another to signal that the Leafs were about to take over, which led to Muzzin blasting a power play goal in the last minute, and that was after he was the one who originally drew the penalty. Ducks got one back in the third, but the Leafs followed that up with 3 unanswered goals by Brown, Nylander, and Janssen's second of the game. Man had 4 points on the night. Gibson was pulled after 5 goals on 30 shots, which represented the 3rd game in a row he had been pulled. Things are not looking very good for Anaheim these days. And around the same day, the Maple Leafs faithful were treated to some exciting news regarding the Matthews contract extension. I know it's just 5 years rather than the max 8. It's a lot of money, a lot of signing bonus, but if I'm not mistaken, it's a little lower than the numbers that had been leaked before the signing. I think it's great news to have the face of the franchise sign for this season plus 5 more. No one can tell what will happen in the future, but I'm hopeful for lots of Maple Leaf success in at least those 5 years. The last game I'll recap today is the matchup versus Ottawa. These teams played early in the season when it looked like Ottawa was going to at least give it some effort. All illusions of that are gone now. They're fighting to re-sign or trade their top guys, and they're probably at the point where they're considering a significant drop in the standings, looking forward to the upcoming draft, where they don't own a first-round pick at the moment. Sportsnet is still pushing the Battle of Ontario promos, but I'm quite doubtful that any of that will happen on the ice in the near future. In a confusing back-to-back game, the Leafs scored first through Zach Hyman, but found themselves behind in the second after a Duchesne goal. Leafs got their act back together. Janssen scored a backhander. Matthews got one too. Marner to Tavares gave the Leafs a 2-goal lead heading into the third period. Ottawa got one back at the 42nd mark and then tied it up at the 16-minute mark. Luckily, a Riley rush from his zone all the way to the Ottawa net gave the Leafs the lead for good. And that was in spite of a crazy last minute at the end where the Leafs just couldn't seem to get the puck out of their zone and towards the Ottawa empty net. I think the Leafs will be satisfied with the 2 points, but I wouldn't call this a classic matchup between the Ontario rivals. Quick look at the standings shows the Leafs in second place in the Atlantic with an important matchup with the Canadiens coming right up. We've talked about Leafs Boston all season, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on Leafs Montreal for the playoffs. Teams play several more times before the end of the season, and it would make for a classic matchup in the playoffs. Thanks for watching, especially if you're a repeat viewer. Feel free to subscribe and like the channel. The Twitter account hasn't changed, @OverseasLeafs. Go check that out for any updates during and after all Maple Leafs games.